I always believed that living in a quiet suburb, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city, would bring me peace and safety. But I was wrong. It all started when a new resident moved into the house next door. His name was Jonathan Miller. Jonathan was a middle-aged man with pale skin and deep wrinkles on his face. He always wore dark glasses, even on rainy days. There was an inexplicable coldness about him, but I didn't pay much attention to it since neighbors don't always become friends. One evening as I was coming home from work, I saw him in his yard. He was burying something in the ground, something small, perhaps a box. I decided not to bother him and went inside. The next day, waking up early in the morning, I smelled something strange. It was something rotten, like meat that had been left out in the sun for too long. I decided to check where the smell was coming from and went outside. The smell intensified as I approached the fence that separated my yard from Jonathan's. Then I noticed that the ground where he had buried something the day before looked disturbed. I couldn't stand the mystery and decided to ask Jonathan what had happened. Approaching his door, I rang the bell. There was no answer. I knocked on the door, but again, no response. It looked like he had disappeared. It was strange since his car was in the driveway. For several days in a row, I saw strangers entering Jonathan's house, but none of them ever came out. My anxiety grew, and I decided to call the police, but they didn't listen to me, thinking it was just my imagination. One evening, as I was almost asleep, I was awakened by a loud noise coming from the neighboring house. It sounded like a scream. I decided I couldn't wait any longer and had to find out what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly climbed over the fence. Sneaking to Jonathan's house, I noticed that the basement window was open. I decided to climb inside. The basement was dark and damp. I heard faint moans and followed the sound. At the end of the corridor, I saw a locked door. When I opened it, I was horrified. People chained up lay on the floor. They were exhausted and barely alive. I had no time to react when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Jonathan. He was holding a knife. His eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, gleamed with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," he said coldly. I realized I had no choice. I had to save these people and myself. I lunged at him, trying to knock the knife out of his hands. A struggle ensued, during which I felt the knife graze my arm. The pain was unbearable, but the adrenaline kept me going. I managed to knock the knife out of Jonathan's hands, and we both fell to the floor. Suddenly, I heard the sound of police sirens. One of the neighbors, hearing the commotion, had called the police. It was my salvation. The police stormed into the house, and Jonathan was arrested. I freed the people and told the police everything that had happened. Jonathan Miller turned out to be a serial killer who had disappeared many years ago and changed his name. This story left a deep scar on my soul. I never thought an ordinary neighbor could turn out to be a monster. Now I know that evil can hide behind the most innocent smile. Some time after those events, I moved to another city. Now I live in an apartment where there are no neighbors nearby, and it brings me peace. But every night before bed, I remember that horrific evening when I confronted true evil. My new home is quiet and peaceful, but now I'm always on guard. I've become more cautious about the people around me and try not to trust appearances, because behind a friendly mask, a real monster can be hiding. My name is Alex, and I always considered myself lucky. Living in a small town in Oregon, I had a great job, a wonderful girlfriend, and seemingly carefree life. My house was on a quiet street with lovely neighbors. One evening, coming home after a long workday, I noticed something unusual. In the house across the street, where no one had lived for many years, the window suddenly lit up. It was an old, abandoned house that everyone considered a ruin. I stopped for a moment and decided to check what was happening. The next day, I noticed new furniture in the yard and a truck parked outside. The neighbors had already started gossiping about the new residents, but no one had seen them yet. I decided to greet the new neighbors and find out who they were. As I approached the house, the door opened, and a woman appeared on the threshold. She was middle-aged with long black hair and pale skin. Her gaze was cold, but she smiled at me. "Hello," I said. "I'm Alex. I live across the street." I decided to say hi and offer help with the move. "Hello," she replied quietly. "My name is Lydia. Thank you for the offer, but we've already set everything up." Her voice was quiet and somewhat eerie, but I tried not to pay attention to it. After a brief conversation, I returned home, still feeling a strange tension. Since then, strange things began to happen. Every night, I heard whispers coming from Lydia's house. It was a quiet but clear voice repeating the same words. I couldn't understand what was being said, but it disturbed me. One night, I decided to go and check what was happening. Armed with a flashlight, I quietly approached Lydia's house. The windows were darkened, but I saw a faint light seeping through the curtains. I got closer and peeked through the window. What I saw made my heart stop. Lydia stood in a room surrounded by candles. She was standing in front of an old mirror, whispering words I couldn't decipher. Her face was contorted into a horrifying grimace, and her eyes glowed red. I jumped back from the window and ran home without looking back. That night I couldn't sleep, as I kept hearing the same whisper. In the morning, I decided to go to the local priest and tell him what I had seen. The priest listened to me and suggested we go to Lydia's house together. We approached the house and knocked on the door. Lydia opened it, her face calm, but her eyes showed anxiety. "What do you need?" she asked coldly. The priest started the conversation, explaining that we had come to help. But Lydia's face suddenly changed, her eyes glowing red again, and she began to whisper the same words. The priest took out a cross and began to recite prayers, but this only made things worse. Lydia started screaming and crying, her body convulsing. We tried to help, but suddenly all the candles in the house flared up brightly, and the mirror began to crack. We ran out of the house, barely escaping the flames. The entire house eventually caught fire and burned to the ground. Firefighters who arrived at the scene found no trace of Lydia or any signs of her presence. Since then, I no longer heard the whispers, but the feeling of tension remained. I moved to another town, trying to forget those terrifying events. But at night, when I go to bed, I sometimes hear the same whisper coming from the darkness. And then I realize that Lydia never disappeared. She's just waiting for her time. Time passed, but peace never fully returned to me. My girlfriend Anna couldn't understand why I had become so anxious and quiet. I didn't dare to tell her what I had seen and experienced. She would think I had lost my mind. One day, as I was coming home from work, I noticed an old man standing by the place where Lydia's house once stood. He was looking at the ruins, smiling strangely. "Did you know who lived here?" I asked as I approached. "Oh, yes," he replied, not taking his eyes off the ruins. "She was my daughter, Lydia." I was shocked. Was this her father? I had many questions, but the old man seemed to know more than he was saying. "What happened to her?" I finally asked. The old man sighed and looked me in the eye. His gaze was deep and sad. "She was always a bit strange," he said. "As a child, she often talked to someone invisible. We thought it was just her imagination. But after her mother's death, she became completely different. She started getting into the occult, old books, and rituals. I tried to help her, but nothing worked. She disappeared many years ago, and I didn't know where she was. I felt a chill down my spine. Everything I had seen and heard was taking on new meaning." "She came back to finish what she started," the old man said, as if reading my thoughts. "And now she's here waiting." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was thank the old man and leave. At home, I couldn't find peace. Anna noticed my anxiety and tried to ask, but I just shook my head. "It's a long story," I said. But she wouldn't give up. Eventually, I decided to tell her everything. She listened attentively, without interrupting. When I finished, she looked worried but not scared. "We need to find a way to get rid of this curse," she said firmly. "We can't just live in fear." Her determination gave me hope. We decided to find the old man and learn more about what had happened to Lydia. Maybe he knew how to end this horror once and for all. The next day, we went looking for the old man. We found him in an old cottage on the outskirts of town. He was surprised to see us, but agreed to help. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. You must return to the place where the house burned down and perform a ritual. But be careful. Lydia won't just stand by." We knew it was risky, but we had no other choice. At night, we returned to the ruins and began the ritual. The priest, whom we also invited, recited prayers while we lit candles and repeated the words given to us by the old man. Suddenly, Lydia appeared from the darkness. Her eyes glowed red, and she began to scream. Her scream was so eerie that I felt my blood freeze. But we continued the ritual. The priest raised the cross and continued reciting prayers, and Lydia began to retreat. Eventually, her body vanished into the flame of the candles, and everything fell silent. Since then, we have not heard the whispers or seen anything strange. The old man disappeared, just like Lydia. But I will always remember those terrifying nights and how we fought the evil that came to us through the old house. Anna and I stayed together, but now we know that evil can appear anywhere and any time. Sometimes at night, I still feel Lydia's cold breath, but now I know that we can face any evil if we stand together. I had long dreamed of a break from the city noise and hustle. Feeling constantly tired from work and stress, I decided to buy a small mobile home in a remote area. A quiet corner in nature promised the peace and tranquility I so desperately needed. Finding a suitable option, I quickly finalized the deal and soon moved in. The house stood at the edge of a forest, far from the nearest village. There were few neighbors, and they lived at a considerable distance from each other. In the first few days, I enjoyed the silence and fresh air, busying myself with setting up the new home. One day, while arranging things in the yard, a man approached me. "Hi, I'm Mike, your neighbor," he said warmly, extending his hand. I gladly shook his hand, introducing myself in return. At first, Mike seemed friendly and polite. We talked about the weather, the surrounding places, and he suggested a few local shops and restaurants. However, over time, his behavior began to change. He started coming over frequently without invitation, imposing his conversations. At first, it was a bit uncomfortable, but I didn't give it much thought. However, one night when I woke up in the middle of the night and saw his silhouette outside the window, fear gripped me. The next day, I decided to talk to him about it, but Mike just smiled and said it must have been a dream. Since then, he began showing up even more often, watching my every move. I started feeling like I was under surveillance, unable to work in the garden or relax on the porch without feeling his eyes on me. One evening, returning home after a trip to the city, I saw Mike standing near my house with a flashlight in his hand. He looked irritated and angry. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "What are you doing here?" he snapped back. "You city folks don't belong here. You know nothing about these places." His words were filled with such hostility that I felt a chill run down my spine. Mike accused me of trespassing on land that he claimed belonged to him. I tried to explain that I had bought the house legally, but he just laughed ominously in response. From that moment on, the situation began to escalate. Mike not only continued to watch me, but also started showing aggression. One time he barged into my house, yelling that I was disturbing the balance and bringing misfortune. He looked insane, his eyes gleaming with hatred, foam forming at the corners of his mouth. I seriously considered selling the house and even calling the police for my safety. The next day, I went to the local police station to report my neighbor. The officer listened attentively, but said they couldn't do anything without concrete evidence. With each passing day, my anxiety grew. Mike began appearing at the most unexpected moments, when I was working in the garden, having dinner on the porch, or just resting inside. His presence became unbearable, and his words increasingly threatening. One night, as I was coming home late, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Mike following me with a knife in his hand. My heart raced. Adrenaline surged. "You thought you could just come here and everything would be fine," he shouted. "You know nothing about this place, about its secrets." I realized the situation was serious, and I needed help. Without hesitation, I rushed to the house, locked all the doors, and called the police. However, by the time they arrived, Mike had disappeared. The police searched the area but found no trace of Mike. They advised me to be cautious and, if possible, temporarily leave the house. Feeling helpless, I gathered the most necessary things and headed to the nearest hotel. Over the next few days, I tried to find information about Mike. It turned out that very little was known about him. The locals knew him as a recluse who was always a bit odd but had never shown such aggression. Realizing I could no longer stay in this place, I decided to sell the house. While processing the documents, I stayed at the hotel, constantly feeling fear and danger. Finally, all the formalities were completed, and I returned to the city. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was still somewhere nearby, watching me. His image, his sinister gaze, and threats haunted my dreams. Over time, I tried to forget about the incident, but even now, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night, I feel someone watching me from the darkness. Maybe Mike was right, and there really is something about that place I don't understand. But one thing I know for sure, I will never return there. Weeks passed as I tried to return to a normal life, but the nightmarish memories wouldn't let me rest. Mike and his gaze followed me everywhere. One day, I decided to visit the local archive to learn more about the area where my former house stood. In the archive, I found a few old newspaper clippings. One of them detailed a series of mysterious disappearances in that area over 100 years ago. All the missing were people who had come from the city, seeking rest in nature. The local residents believed that a curse lay on those lands, preventing city folks from staying there long. Another clipping told of a man named Michael, who had lived in those places many years ago. He was known for his hostility toward outsiders, and according to rumors, possessed knowledge of old local rituals. He disappeared without a trace, and his house remained abandoned. I couldn't believe my eyes. It all sounded too familiar. Could it be that Mike, my neighbor, was somehow connected to this Michael from the past? Perhaps he was a descendant, or even the same man who had returned to protect his land. My thoughts were interrupted by an encounter with one of the local residents who worked at the archive. He told me that the legend of the curse was still alive among the locals. They believed that the spirits of those who had died or disappeared still guarded those lands, preventing city folks from living there. After this, I understood that returning there was no longer possible. Even if I sold the house, this peace would never return to me. The feeling of danger and fear would remain forever. Returning to the city, I started a new life, trying to forget about that terrifying experience. But sometimes at night, I still feel someone watching me from the darkness and hear Mike's quiet whisper, reminding me that those places belong not to us, city folks.